Conditions May Apply by CinnamonPinecones. Read by Distracted by Books. Chapter 139. Frick, a Silver Lining. Author's note: Burnin's real name is Moe Kamiji, which will be relevant to know for point-of-view comprehension. Hitoshi wasn't too prideful to admit that he was nervous for his first patrol. He didn't have a great track record for nighttime walks through the city. He forced himself to focus on the facts that A, he would be with Eraserhead the whole time, and B, he knew how to defend himself now, at least to some degree. Most of his classmates could still beat his ass, but he was good enough to get into UA. That had to count for something. So far, things had been largely uneventful. They had stopped some creep who was following a lady around, but that didn't really involve any sort of confrontation. Aizawa just started walking with the woman and sent a glare over to the man behind them, who promptly scurried off. They walked her home and she thanked them, but since then, little of note had happened. That fact made Hitoshi consider how shit his luck was. They were out here quite literally looking for trouble and coming up short. But just wandering around on his own had earned him 2 of the most traumatizing experiences of his life. That's some bullshit if you asked him. The night was still young, though. Well, young relative to daylight. Technically, 12:36 a.m. was the next day, but there was still plenty of dark skies ahead of them. He was a little on edge and kept waiting for the other shoe to drop. So when a voice called out from a nearby alley, he did end up jumping a little, but only a little. Eraser, look what the cat dragged in. What the hell are you doing on this side of the city? Uptown finally wear you out? A woman's voice echoed off the brick walls. Aizawa sighed quietly, seeming to resign himself to social interaction. Hitoshi felt that sigh in his bones, and he had to hold back a laugh. Sakura, he greeted the woman with a nod. Oh, don't act too excited to see me. People might get the wrong idea, she said teasingly as she approached. Wouldn't want that, would we? She asked, laying a hand on Aizawa's chest and winking. Suddenly, Hitoshi felt supremely uncomfortable. Aizawa gently lifted and discarded the woman's hand with the same bored expression he always wore. She laughed as she turned her focus to Hitoshi. Oh, you get yourself a new little sidekick for every district? She asked. He saw Aizawa tense at the question. Wait, Aizawa had a sidekick? And he patrolled Uptown? Hitoshi didn't think anyone patrolled Uptown. That's why it was like that. He's a student. Behave yourself, he admonished before she could even start. Aw, you're too cute, Eraser. Empty nesting. Couldn't go a couple weeks without Ivy? How are they doing? I assume you keep in touch. Aizawa sent a glare her way that would have probably turned a lesser man to stone, and did not answer her question. She seemed relatively unaffected by the look, but he had clearly communicated whatever it was that he had wanted to communicate. Damn, okay. Didn't know you were rolling with baby Narc over here. What's your name anyways, kid? She pivoted the conversation and turned her attention back to Hitoshi. Narc? What would he be narking about? Was Ivy the sidekick she had been talking about? Mind Jack. He introduced himself flatly. She looked at him, then back to Aizawa, then back to him as she bit her lip, seemingly trying to hold in a laugh. She looked away from both of them and made a face before releasing her lip and turning back to Hitoshi. Eraserhead and Mind Jack. Answer me honestly, kid. Are you a clone of him grown in a lab? She asked, cocking her head toward Aizawa before breaking out in a fit of laughter. Hitoshi could only hope that the blush he could feel spreading on his cheeks wasn't visible in the low light. He was suddenly grateful that Aizawa didn't deem him skilled enough to take his capture weapon on patrols yet, because that would have really been the final nail in the coffin. Not last I checked, no. He answered as coolly as he could manage. She laughed again at his monotone response, which Hitoshi realized too late was far too similar to Aizawa's flat drawl. He saw the man in question rolling his eyes in his periphery. Did you need something, or were you just interrupting our patrol for your own amusement? Aizawa butted in, clearly fed up with her antics. His change in tone wasn't lost on her. Her laughter cut off abruptly and her smile fell. Don't know why you're even bothering over here. I could take a nap in lingerie on this side of town and I'd wake up with a blanket on me. Things have been getting worse in Uptown with... She trailed off and gave Hitoshi a once-over before continuing, them gone. I've been keeping an eye on things. I'm not taking a student into Uptown. If anything major develops, let me know, and I'll handle it. He snipped back. Nothing major would develop if it's out of my hands, Sakura. Now is not the time. Aizawa interrupted her with cool anger. You're being awfully suspicious about whatever the hell happened to them in the first place. You know, we only trusted you because they did. She jabbed right back. This conversation was a roller coaster, and the tension in the air was palpable. Hitoshi wanted to leave as much as he wanted to stay. He shouldn't be hearing all of this, but it was like a train wreck. He couldn't look away. Are you threatening me? Aizawa asked incredulously. I'm just saying, you shouldn't be surprised if people stop cooperating with you. I trust you. I know you better than most of them back there. But people are talking, and they ain't talking nice. Sakura responded, saying the last bit in a low tone. What the hell was going on here? He was learning far more about Eraser than he had expected to, and he was pretty sure that he had never felt more awkward in his life. Noted, Aizawa responded flatly. She huffed an annoyed breath out of her nose and rolled her eyes at him. Once she was done giving Aizawa a disappointed glare, she turned back to Hitoshi. You keep an eye on him, Eraser baby, she said in an exasperated tone before ruffling his hair and walking away. That was maybe one of the weirdest things that he had ever witnessed. He had so many questions, but he knew better than to ask them. Eraserhead had always been mysterious, and getting more information about him would only make it worse. Their patrol was going nicely. Wednesday evenings weren't Moe's normal hours, but she'd done evening patrols before. They tended to be more lively than afternoons, but not usually as bad as a proper nighttime patrol. There was still some light in the sky during this time of year, and that scared off the more sinister characters, or at least it usually did. There was a picket line camped out in front of City Hall. They were protesting some sort of local legislation. It was something to do with public works funding, she thought. Moe didn't stay as up to date on those kinds of things as she probably should, but the protesters had been out for a few days now, and they were peaceful, so she didn't mind them. However, it seemed as though not everyone was so unbothered. The four of them were walking a block over when they heard shouting, to which they all responded without hesitation. By the looks of it, 5 people were trying to get the protesters to leave, and when they refused, things started to get ugly. They were certainly leaving now, but apparently their fleeing was too little, too late, and these people were looking for a fight. They'd have their fight, but they weren't going to like how she gave it to them. She was about to charge in when a large hand caught her by the shoulder, holding her back. The two interns charged ahead, and she tried to wrench her shoulder out of its restraint, but it was no good. When she realized who it was that was holding her in place, she stopped struggling quickly. "Don't interrupt, unless absolutely necessary. I want to see him deal with this on his own," Endeavor commanded. She did as ordered, but it did not sit right with her. Playing it fast and loose with your son was one thing, but if Jade got hurt, his parents had no personal stake in the Endeavor agency. They wouldn't hesitate to file a lawsuit and possibly start a smear campaign depending on how pissed they were. Hell, even if nothing went wrong, they were still in public and bystanders were witnessing them doing jack while their interns handled the situation. That wasn't exactly a good look, and none of that was to even mention that they were kids, for heaven's sake. Startlingly competent kids, but kids nonetheless. Every second she spent standing there was another year off her life. There were 5 people, 4 men and 1 woman, 2 mutation quirks, 1 emitter, 1 unknown, and 1 transformation quirk, if the rapidly growing Rocky figure was anything to go by. Shoto had cemented the unknown man in place with ice and managed to freeze the big guy's feet to the ground as well, but she could tell that wasn't going to hold him for long. Jade was tied up with 3 opponents who had him surrounded. 2 men, who must be twins, or at least brothers, looked to have tire mutation quirks, and they were taking every hit Jade dished out. Their rubberized, hulking mass had no issue bouncing the force right back to their opponent. A woman with an electricity quirk was paired up with them, and again, their rubbery forms had no issue taking the waves of sparks sent toward the 3 of them. But Jade was not so lucky. He'd been dodging it well enough so far, but it was only a matter of time before a shock hit him. And if that in and of itself wasn't enough to take him down, then whatever damage the other 2 men could do while he was immobilized certainly would. Shoto was still struggling with a behemoth man who had some sort of golem quirk. He had upgraded from freezing the man's feet in place to encasing him entirely. But the golem kept moving, cracking himself free, ripping up slabs of the road, and stomping down to break off the ice and asphalt stuck to him. His fire only served to dry the man's skin out, and Shoto seemed hesitant to use it any more than he already was. Jade was still fighting with the 2 men, and she noticed he was getting further and further away. Why wasn't he trying to take out the woman? Clearly his force was not going to take down the tire boys, so why not shift tactics? And where was he going? All of these questions were answered succinctly as she watched Jade walk over to a railing composed of spaced-out poles connected by a chain threaded between the length outside of a bar. Likely put up to stop drunks wandering into the street upon exiting the establishment. He grabbed the chain, and with one yank, he broke it free from the poles it was bolted to and swung it out like a lasso, hitting both of the men and pulling them together in an unwelcome metal embrace. She didn't think that would be enough to hold them for long. Their limbs weren't really restrained, and if left attended, they could simply untangle themselves. But she should have figured Jade was smarter than that. He waited until the woman with the electricity quirk poised to fire at him again, and with a strength that showed that he had only really been toying with the tire boys this whole time, he kicked them into her. The 3 of them went down in a screaming pile, and the unpleasant smell of burning rubber filled the air. Returning her attention to Shoto, she saw how he had put up an ice barrier around the golem man, sufficiently keeping civilians out and caging the man in, at least to some degree. It would take him a while to get through the barricade, and ideally, that delay would be enough time to stop further destruction. It was a good tactic, but it was only buying time. Moe wasn't even sure what she would do against an enemy like that. probably call for backup if she was being honest, but Shoto was holding his own. Shoto, get me up to his level! She heard Jade shout as he charged into the fray with the golem. Ah, backup. Good. Shoto made a series of pillars not dissimilar to the ones she had seen in the sports festival, ones they both knew that Jade had little to no issue maneuvering around with grace, a skill which he proved again. He jumped between the pillars, which steadily increased in height until he reached the last man standing. Leaping from the final pillar with a flash of green lightning, he came down hard on the giant, punching the junction of his neck and shoulder with a loud crack, followed by an even louder crash as the man's unconscious body hit the ground. Thankfully, Jade didn't hit the ground quite as hard. As the dust settled, she saw that he had stuck the landing and rolled with his momentum. He was stretching his arm out in circles like it was sore, but he was moving it, so it was unlikely to be anything but sprained at worst. She spared a glance over to Endeavor. He looked absolutely furious and was glaring at her intern. He wouldn't start shit with a 15-year-old in the middle of a crowd. He was hot-headed, but not that stupid, so she had no qualms about getting as far away from him as possible. The first 3 perps that Jade had taken down needed to be properly cuffed, and that was something she could do. Anything that she said or did to get the boss's attention right now was only going to end poorly. Getting out of the way was the best call for everyone. That would have been much easier if we had switched opponents, Izuku said with a laugh as he made his way back to Shoto. Shoto looked at the first guy he had frozen to the street, who was still uselessly struggling to get free, then to the other 3, who Burnin was wrestling into handcuffs, then to the golem man who had shrunken back down to normal height after hitting the ground, and he laughed. Yes, that would have been far more efficient. Shoto agreed with a smile which quickly faded when Endeavor walked over to them. Oh, he was angry. Like, really angry. Shit. They should have switched opponents. Todoroki didn't get the chance to look good for the bystanders and their cameras. That was probably why Endeavor was so mad. Izuku stole his son's glory. Again. Shoto, with me. We will continue patrol. They can deal with the paperwork, he ordered tersely. He noticed that he had left Burnin to cuff all 5 offenders, but he was pretty sure that that did not exonerate him from paperwork. Shoto was involved in the takedown. Even if he didn't land the final hit on anyone, and Endeavor was still a witness. He knew better than to bring that point up, though, so he kept his mouth shut. Endeavor's anger was palpable, and the tinge of fear in Todoroki's eyes did not go unnoticed either. He felt a dire need to keep Todoroki away from him, but he knew that anything he tried would only make things worse. So he watched him walk away while bile churned in his gut. Burnin took care of cuffing everyone, and Izuku called in the police with a practiced ease that he forgot he wasn't supposed to have before it was too late. Whatever. He didn't think anyone besides the operator heard him anyway. He saw Burnin reach for her comm, so he shouted over to her, "Already called it in. Cops are on their way." She gave him a surprised look, but thankfully she didn't question him. "Good work, Jade. Now we wait," she said awkwardly as she took her post next to the restrained criminals. There were no civilian casualties as far as he could tell. The protesters had tucked tail and ran, which he couldn't fault them for, and everyone left milling about were just random passersby who weren't close enough to have gotten injured. So Izuku stayed put next to Burnin in case any of the idiots decided to try and make a break for it. Participating in the turning over of criminals to the police was even more dull than watching the process from the rooftops. Where was Eraser to do all the boring shit for him? He silently bemoaned the bureaucracy of it all because by the time the charade was over, patrol had ended for the night. Come on, newbie. Time for your first proper incident report. It's as fun as it sounds, I promise, Burnin cooed as the police drove away. This was going to be a long night, though not as long as Todoroki's, he's sure. By the time the paperwork was completed, Endeavor and Todoroki were long gone, leaving Izuku in the hands of the flamin' sidekicks and their Spartan lodgings. Burnin passed him off to one of the male sidekicks to show him around, and thankfully they had a spare toothbrush for him. They didn't have a change of clothes, but his boxers and undershirt were good enough. They were a bit ripe, but he had dealt with worse. He probably wouldn't be able to go for a nightly walk like this. However, he was far more worried about Todoroki than he was about himself. What was his father going to do that required ditching witnesses? They would be back too late for the usual family dinner. Would Natsu and Fuyumi still be around? Would they be able to help? Was Todoroki all alone? His frantic worrying had to wait until the shift swap was over and everyone had settled. He didn't have headphones, and he couldn't have anyone overhear whatever might be waiting for him on the recording device. The sleeping quarters were shared, which meant that Izuku probably wasn't going to sleep tonight at all. But that was besides the point. The point was he didn't have anywhere private to check the tapes. He had set the pen up in the training room like he had planned, and he hoped to Kami that if anything happened, it happened in there. It was midnight by the time the locker room finally cleared out. Izuku shut himself in the furthest stall and lowered the volume as much as he could while still being able to hear it. Sure enough, his bug had picked something up. From around 8 p.m. to 11 p.m., his watch told him there was consistent activity. Izuku didn't want to see what was waiting for him, but he hit play anyway. Todoroki and his father were still in their hero uniforms when Todoroki was roughly shoved through the doorway. What followed after was a brutal training regime that made Gran Torino seem soft. Or maybe Izuku was just scared of fire. Endeavor did not give Todoroki a break. He was relentless, barely waiting for his son to get up before charging at him again. It went on for ages, most of which Izuku skipped through for his own sanity's sake, until Todoroki stopped getting up. He watched the scene play out before him. Based on the timestamp, this had been less than an hour ago. Get up! Endeavor barked after Todoroki didn't immediately get to his feet. It's been hours. I don't want to hear your excuses. The real world won't coddle you, and you will never make it to the top if you refuse to train to your limits. Your performance today was pathetic. It was shameful. Get up! He watched as Endeavor walked over to Todoroki, who was still laying on the ground, closed his fist around his friend's arm, and hauled his nearly limp form up onto unsteady feet. That must have hurt, and probably left a bruise. Izuku did his best to focus on making a game plan moving forward, and not on the awful sensation of bile churning in his stomach. Would documenting the bruise be necessary if he had this footage? Taking a sneaky picture in the locker room was very much not something he wanted to do, but there was no way of asking for a picture without raising suspicions. His thoughts were abruptly halted by the part of his brain that was still watching the footage. Endeavor let Todoroki go, and he wobbled around trying to catch his balance. His whole body was shaking, either from fear or exhaustion. Izuku wasn't sure. Before he even got his feet planted, Endeavor sent another wave of flames at him, and he fell back several feet and onto the ground with a sickening yelp of pain. I didn't make you to be a second-rate failure. That boy was running circles around you, Shoto. Get up! He didn't get up. Izuku watched as Todoroki curled into a fetal position and brought his arms up to cover his head. He listened to his heavy breaths, and he was glad to have skipped dinner tonight. He didn't trust his ability to keep it down right now. He could see the rage building in Endeavor's body language, and he was so scared that he was about to go over and kick his son. But Izuku thanked gods that he didn't believe in when he turned on his heel toward the door instead. I expect you to be up at dawn, he ordered over his shoulder before slamming the door on his way out. The jostling shifted the camera slightly, making it so that 2/3 of the view was just the floor, but thankfully Todoroki was still visible in the upper third of the frame. He still wasn't moving beyond the subtle trembling of his limbs. Izuku could still hear him struggling to regulate his breaths. Seconds turned into agonizing minutes, and his breathing was only becoming more erratic. He shouldn't be watching this. This was too far. This wasn't evidence anymore. This was a vulnerable moment that he wasn't meant to see. But he couldn't look away. After a few minutes, he noticed a layer of frost developing on the floor surrounding Todoroki. The ice spread out from where he was scrunched in on himself, and Izuku watched as it got thicker and thicker until it covered Todoroki in a layer of frigid crystals. A few more minutes passed, and eventually his breaths came steadier and his trembling subsided. He must have been using the ice to ground himself. That was smart, or maybe it was instinctual. Either way, it was upsetting to imagine how many times Todoroki had been through this song and dance. Once he was able to stand up, he used his flames to melt away the evidence of what he had done. He stood in the middle of the room, staring blankly into nothing for several minutes before he finally limped out of the room with silent footsteps and shut the door behind himself so gently that it would have probably been impossible to hear if the mic hadn't been attached to the door itself. The screen went black and quiet. He just stared at the dim, empty room blankly. This was his fault. Endeavor was mad because he had been faster than Todoroki today, and this was all his fault. No, Todoroki said it himself. Endeavor always has something to be angry about, right? This would have happened regardless. It wasn't his fault. It wasn't his fault. His insistence felt hollow, and it did nothing to settle the burning guilt in his gut. His hands shook as he grabbed his phone and sent a message to Todoroki, one that hopefully wouldn't rouse any suspicions. Midoriya, we finally got all the paperwork done. Burnin explained everything in great detail. How's it on your end? He was sure that the sarcasm in the first line would be lost on Todoroki, but he didn't really care. He just needed to hear from him, to know that he was okay. Well, he clearly wasn't okay. Izuku had seen as much. It didn't look like he was hurt too badly, physically at least. Endeavor wouldn't hurt Todoroki irreparably, and Izuku did his best to let that fact calm his nerves. This footage was enough to start a case, surely. Silver lining. He had to look for the silver lining, just like Fuyumi-san told him. End of chapter.